The final phase of Marcus Thompson's battle against corruption began with a series of events that would reshape the political landscape forever. The authentication of Victoria Sinclair's recordings had taken 3 weeks, but FBI technical analysis confirmed their legitimacy beyond any doubt. Hayes's own voice planning murders and orchestrating cover-ups was now evidence in a federal criminal investigation. Catherine Patterson received the authentication results on a Wednesday morning that felt like Christmas and Judgment Day combined. 22 separate recordings spanning 8 months, documenting the most extensive government conspiracy in decades. The evidence was so overwhelming that even the government's most aggressive defense strategies would crumble under its weight. Meanwhile, Marcus remained in protective custody at the Federal Witness Protection Facility outside the Capitol. The secure environment had allowed him to regain his physical health and mental clarity, but the psychological toll of his ordeal remained significant. He spent his days writing detailed statements for prosecutors and preparing for what would become the most watched testimony in recent history. Dr. Sarah Chun visited Marcus regularly to monitor his mental state and help him process the trauma of discovering his government's betrayal. Their sessions often focused on the philosophical challenge of serving a system that had tried to kill him for telling the truth. How do you maintain faith in justice when the justice system is run by criminals? Marcus asked during one session. By remembering that systems are made up of individuals, Dr. Chin replied. For every corrupt politician, there are dozens of honest prosecutors, judges, and citizens who demand better. Your courage has activated those good people. The breakthrough in public opinion came when the Daily Tribune published Sarah Mitchell's complete investigative files, provided by her editor, who had kept copies hidden for months. The files contained photographs of Guardian Corporation's illegal dumping sites, medical records from contaminated communities, and scheduled interviews with the murdered scientists. Most damaging was Sarah's personal journal, documenting threats she had received and her growing fear that she was being followed. Her final entry, written the day before her death, read, "If something happens to me, look at Guardian Corporation and their political connections. The story I'm investigating is worth killing for." Public outrage reached a breaking point when these files were published. Protest marches erupted in major cities, demanding Hayes's immediate resignation and criminal prosecution. The contaminated communities became symbols of government betrayal, with families holding vigils for loved ones who had died from corporate-sponsored environmental poisoning. Guardian Corporation's board of directors panicked as their stock became worthless, and federal investigators seized company records. CEO William Harrison attempted to distance the company from Hayes, claiming they had been deceived about the political arrangements. But internal emails revealed detailed coordination between corporate executives and government officials. The political establishment began abandoning Hayes in a desperate attempt to save themselves. Cabinet members resigned daily, each claiming ignorance of the conspiracy while providing evidence to prosecutors in exchange for immunity. The governing coalition collapsed as party members distanced themselves from their leader. Judge Elizabeth Warren faced unprecedented pressure as she prepared for the trial that would determine whether high-ranking officials could be held accountable for murder and conspiracy. Death threats against her family intensified, requiring federal protections similar to Marcus's situation. Hayes himself remained defiant, claiming the charges were politically motivated and the evidence was fabricated. His legal team, led by former Supreme Court advocate David Sterling, filed motion after motion challenging the admissibility of the recordings and questioning the credibility of witnesses. Sterling's strategy centered on attacking Marcus's motives and mental state. During pre-trial hearings, he argued that a grief-stricken guard had misinterpreted political conversations and constructed an elaborate fantasy of conspiracy and murder. "Your Honor," Sterling addressed Judge Warren, "we're asked to believe that the Prime Minister confessed to multiple murders within earshot of a royal guard he barely knew. The implausibility of this scenario demonstrates my client's innocence." Patterson countered with the authenticated recordings and supporting evidence that corroborated Marcus's testimony in every detail. The defense wants us to ignore the Prime Minister's own voice planning these crimes. The evidence speaks for itself. The trial began on a Monday morning in February, with security unprecedented in the courthouse's history. Metal detectors, armed guards, and bomb-sniffing dogs created an atmosphere more suited to a military installation than a court of law. Marcus's testimony lasted 3 days and was broadcast live to a transfixed nation. Sitting in the witness box, wearing a simple dark suit instead of his Royal Guard uniform, he recounted the conversation that had changed his life with precise detail and unwavering composure. Sterling's cross-examination was brutal, lasting 6 hours and covering every aspect of Marcus's personal life, military service, and mental health. But Marcus remained consistent, acknowledging uncertainty when appropriate, but never wavering on the core facts he had witnessed. "Mr. Thompson," Sterling pressed during the climax of his questioning, "isn't it true that you've constructed this entire narrative to give meaning to your wife's death and your own sense of purposelessness?" Marcus considered the question carefully before responding. "Sir, my wife died of cancer. This case is about people who were murdered to protect corporate profits. The only connection is that Elena taught me to choose truth over convenience, even when the truth is difficult." The courtroom fell silent as Sterling realized his attack had backfired, making Marcus appear more credible rather than less. The grieving husband seeking justice resonated with jurors more powerfully than any coached testimony could have. Victoria Sinclair's testimony proved equally devastating. Having recovered from her suspicious overdose, she appeared frail but determined as she detailed months of recorded conversations and documentary evidence. Her decision to secretly record meetings had provided the prosecution with an unbreakable chain of evidence. "I recorded these conversations because I feared for my own safety," Sinclair explained. "When people are willing to commit murder for money, being a witness makes you a target." The recordings were played in their entirety, filling the courtroom with Hayes's voice discussing logistics of murder, celebrating successful assassinations, and planning future crimes. Jurors visibly recoiled as they heard their prime minister laugh about Sarah Mitchell's death and debate whether Marcus should be discredited or killed. Sterling attempted to argue that the recordings were taken out of context or edited to sound incriminating. But FBI technical analysis proved they were complete and unaltered, destroying this defense strategy. The prosecution's case concluded with testimony from Tom Bradley about the sabotaged brake lines, Dr. Reed about environmental contamination, and family members of the murder victims. The human cost of Hayes's conspiracy became undeniable as grieving relatives described lives cut short by corporate greed. The defense case lasted only 2 days. Sterling called character witnesses who testified about Hayes's previous public service and argued that the evidence was circumstantial despite the recordings. It was a desperate strategy that convinced no one. Hayes himself chose not to testify, exercising his constitutional right against self-incrimination. This decision protected him from cross-examination, but left jurors with only his recorded voice planning murders as a statement to the court. During closing arguments, Patterson delivered a summation that transformed the courtroom into a cathedral of justice. She stood before the jury holding photographs of Sarah Mitchell, Dr. Elizabeth Hoffman, and Dr. Robert Kim, the 3 people murdered to protect Guardian Corporation's profits. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about whether we live in a nation of laws or a nation where the powerful can kill with impunity." Marcus Thompson risked everything to ensure that these victims would receive justice. Now that responsibility passes to you. Sterling's closing argument focused on reasonable doubt and the supposedly circumstantial nature of the evidence. But his words sounded hollow after weeks of overwhelming testimony and documentary proof. The jury deliberated for 18 hours over 3 days. Their verdict was unanimous on all counts. Hayes was guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, environmental crimes, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations. The courtroom erupted in applause that Judge Warren allowed to continue for several minutes. The sentencing hearing took place 6 weeks later. Hayes received life in prison without possibility of parole, plus additional consecutive sentences totaling 150 years. Judge Warren's comments during sentencing became a defining moment in legal history. "Mr. Hayes, you betrayed every oath you ever took and perverted the office of Prime Minister into an instrument of murder. Your crimes strike at the foundation of democratic government and the rule of law. This sentence reflects society's absolute rejection of your actions. The civil lawsuit concluded with a settlement that exceeded even Patterson's aggressive demands. Guardian Corporation agreed to pay $400 million in damages, $100 million to the families of murder victims, $200 million for environmental cleanup in affected communities, and $100 million to Marcus for his courage in exposing the conspiracy. Marcus donated most of his settlement to establish the Sarah Mitchell Foundation for Investigative Journalism, ensuring that future journalists would have resources to pursue dangerous stories. He kept enough money to live modestly and returned to work as a security consultant for whistleblower protection organizations. The political aftermath reshaped the country's leadership. Hayes's entire administration collapsed, triggering new elections that brought reform-minded leaders to power. New laws strengthened protections for whistleblowers and increased penalties for corporate environmental crimes. Victoria Sinclair received immunity in exchange for her cooperation and testimony. She resigned from government and became an advocate for transparency and accountability in public service. Her recordings had saved democracy by exposing corruption at its highest levels. Guardian Corporation declared bankruptcy and was dissolved, with its assets used to fund environmental restoration in the contaminated communities. CEO William Harrison and 6 other executives received prison sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years. Marcus's life settled into a new routine focused on helping other whistleblowers navigate the legal and personal challenges of speaking truth to power. His apartment was filled with letters from people who found courage in his example to report corruption in their own circumstances. 1 year after the trial, Marcus visited Sarah Mitchell's grave on the anniversary of her death. He brought flowers and a newspaper clipping about the latest environmental cleanup progress in the affected communities. "Your investigation saved thousands of lives," he said quietly, placing the flowers beside her headstone. "Your children will grow up knowing their mother was a hero who died for something that mattered." Standing in the peaceful cemetery, Marcus reflected on the journey that had transformed him from a silent royal guard into a catalyst for justice. The price had been enormous: his career, his safety, his naive faith in government. But the result had been worth every sacrifice. Elena would have been proud of the man he had become. The grief-stricken widower who once stood silently outside meeting room doors had found his voice and used it to topple a corrupt regime. Justice had prevailed, but only because one person had chosen courage over safety. Marcus walked back to his car as the sun set behind the cemetery trees. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new whistleblowers who needed support, new battles against corruption and abuse of power. He had learned that democracy required constant vigilance and occasional heroism from ordinary citizens. The royal guard who had sworn to protect his government had ultimately saved it by exposing its cancer and forcing its renewal. In losing everything he thought he valued, Marcus Thompson had discovered what truly mattered: the courage to stand for truth when the stakes were highest and the costs most severe. His fight was over, but the example he had set would inspire others for generations to come. Sometimes, the most important battles are fought not by armies or politicians, but by individuals who refuse to remain silent when they witness evil. Marcus had proven that even the most powerful criminals could be brought to justice when good people chose to act despite the risks. The $300 million lawsuit had become something far more valuable, a reminder that in a democracy, the truth belongs to the people, not to those who would kill to suppress it. Marcus Thompson, former royal guard and reluctant hero, had helped ensure that reminder would never be forgotten. The weeks following the lawsuit filing brought a cascade of events that transformed Marcus Thompson from an unknown royal guard into the center of a national crisis. Catherine Patterson had been right about one thing: the government would use every weapon at its disposal to destroy him. The first attack came through the media. 3 days after the filing, morning news programs began running stories about a disgruntled royal guard making false accusations against the prime minister. The reports painted Marcus as mentally unstable, claiming he had been showing signs of stress and paranoid behavior since his wife's death. Marcus watched the coverage from his isolated guard post, feeling sick as reporters discussed his personal life with complete strangers offering opinions about his mental state. Former colleagues were interviewed, though their comments were carefully edited to suggest doubt about his reliability. "Thompson was always a little too serious," said one edited clip from Sergeant Mills. After his wife died, he became even more withdrawn. The broadcast didn't include Mills' follow-up comments about Marcus being one of the most ethical and dedicated guards he had ever known. Catherine Patterson called Marcus during his lunch break. "They're moving faster than I expected," she said. "We need to accelerate our timeline. I've scheduled depositions for key witnesses, and I want you to undergo an independent psychiatric evaluation to counter their narrative." The psychiatric evaluation took place at Dr. Sarah Chen's private office. Dr. Chun was a renowned forensic psychiatrist who specialized in cases involving government whistleblowers. She spent 4 hours with Marcus, conducting interviews and psychological tests designed to assess his mental state and credibility. "Mr. Thompson," Dr. Chun concluded, "you show no signs of mental illness, paranoid ideation, or delusional thinking. Your responses indicate someone under significant stress, which is entirely appropriate given your circumstances." The team also located the mechanic who had worked on Sarah Mitchell's car the day before her accident. Tom Bradley had been told to keep quiet about the brake line damage he discovered, damage that was clearly intentional. His original repair report had been confiscated, but he had kept a personal copy. "I knew something wasn't right," Bradley told Patterson's investigators. "Brake lines don't just cut themselves in 3 places. Someone wanted that car to crash, and they wanted it to look like an accident." The breakthrough came when Patterson's team discovered that Victoria Sinclair had been secretly recording her meetings with Hayes for months. As Deputy Prime Minister, she had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the administration's corruption, but felt powerless to stop it alone. The recordings were stored in a safe deposit box at Metropolitan Bank, protected by legal documents that would release them upon her death or if she faced criminal charges. Patterson filed an emergency motion to access the recordings, arguing that they contained evidence of ongoing criminal conspiracy. The motion triggered a legal battle that reached the Supreme Court within days, as government lawyers fought to keep the recordings sealed. During this period, Marcus faced escalating personal attacks. His apartment was broken into twice, though nothing was stolen. His car tires were slashed. Anonymous phone calls continued throughout the night, featuring threats against his deceased wife's memory and promises of violence against him. The isolation at his guard post became more pronounced. His radio was malfunctioning, leaving him without communication with headquarters. His relief guards were often late or failed to arrive altogether, forcing him to work extended shifts. It was clear that someone wanted him exhausted, isolated, and vulnerable. The turning point came during Marcus's formal deposition. Patterson had arranged for it to take place in a secure location with multiple security cameras and independent witnesses. Government lawyers arrived with a team of 6 attorneys, clearly intending to overwhelm and discredit him. Lead counsel for the government, Attorney General Robert Morrison, began with aggressive questioning designed to rattle Marcus. "Mr. Thompson, isn't it true that you've been receiving psychiatric treatment since your wife's death?" "No, sir. I attended grief counseling for 3 months, which is normal and healthy." "And isn't it true that you've been passed over for promotion multiple times due to performance issues?" "No, sir. I've received commendations for my service and have never been disciplined for performance issues." Morrison spent hours trying to poke holes in Marcus's story, questioning every detail and suggesting alternative interpretations. But Marcus remained calm and consistent, sticking to exactly what he had heard and when he had heard it. The crucial moment came when Morrison made a tactical error. Trying to suggest that Marcus had misheard the conversation, he said, "Isn't it possible that the Prime Minister was discussing a completely different matter? Perhaps a conversation about political opposition research rather than actual violence?" Patterson seized the opportunity. "So you're acknowledging that my client heard the Prime Minister discussing some form of unethical activity? The only question is the degree of criminality." Morrison realized his mistake too late. "That's not what I said. But you just confirmed that the Prime Minister was engaged in discussions inappropriate enough that you're trying to minimize them rather than deny them entirely." The deposition transcript was sealed, but news of Morrison's stumble leaked within hours. Political commentators began speculating about what the government was trying to hide, and why they seemed so desperate to discredit one royal guard. Public opinion started shifting when environmental groups released their own studies of the affected communities. Independent testing confirmed dangerous contamination levels that matched Dr. Reed's findings exactly. Cancer clusters in 4 different towns couldn't be explained away as coincidence. Sarah Mitchell's editor at the Daily Tribune came forward with her final story notes, found hidden in her desk after her death. The notes detailed her investigation into Guardian Corporation and included scheduled interviews with the 2 environmental scientists who later died. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Victoria Sinclair's position became increasingly precarious as pressure mounted for her to testify. She had been present during the recorded conversations, but was caught between her oath of office and her knowledge of serious crimes. Late one evening, she contacted Patterson directly. "I want to meet," Sinclair said during a brief phone call. "But it has to be completely secure. If Hayes discovers I'm talking to you, I'll be the next accident victim." Patterson arranged the meeting at a private residence owned by a retired judge. Sinclair arrived looking exhausted and frightened, carrying a briefcase that contained copies of the recordings and additional documents. "I've been documenting Hayes's activities for 8 months, she explained. "I initially thought I could influence him internally, convince him to change course. But the Guardian Corporation owns him completely. They've paid millions into his campaign fund and promised him a position on their board after he leaves office." The recordings were devastating. Over 20 conversations detailed the systematic cover-up of environmental crimes, the murders of investigators, and plans for eliminating additional witnesses. Hayes's voice was clearly identifiable, discussing the logistics of making deaths appear accidental. In one particularly damning recording, Hayes laughed about Sarah Mitchell's death. "The journalist problem is solved. One break line, one tree, and suddenly, she's not asking inconvenient questions anymore." Another recording captured Hayes instructing Morrison to neutralize the guard situation and discussing whether Marcus could be discredited or if he would need to be permanently silenced. Patterson worked through the night preparing additional court filings. The new evidence was explosive enough to trigger immediate criminal charges, but she needed to present it strategically to maximize impact and protect her witnesses. Meanwhile, Marcus continued his lonely vigil at the remote facility, unaware that his case had just gained the evidence needed to bring down the Prime Minister. His nightly routine consisted of walking empty hallways, monitoring silent security feeds, and writing letters to Elena about the progress of his fight for justice. The isolation was taking its toll. Marcus had lost weight, and his sleep was constantly interrupted by threatening phone calls. But his resolve remained strong. Every morning, he reminded himself of why he had chosen to speak out. Sarah Mitchell's children deserved to know the truth about their mother's death. The government's next move was predictably vicious. They leaked fabricated psychiatric reports claiming Marcus had been hospitalized for mental illness years earlier. The documents were sophisticated forgeries that would have fooled casual inspection, but Patterson's document experts quickly identified them as fraudulent. The forgeries backfired spectacularly when Patterson held a press conference revealing the attempted deception. Standing beside Dr. Chun and Tom Bradley, she presented a timeline that demolished the government's credibility. "They've resorted to forging medical documents to silence a whistleblower," Patterson announced. "This desperate action proves they have no legitimate defense against the evidence we've presented." Media coverage began shifting decisively in Marcus's favor. Editorial boards called for independent investigations, and opposition politicians demanded Hayes's resignation. Public protests emerged in the contaminated communities, with families holding pictures of loved ones who had died from cancer. The pressure became too much for several government officials. 3 members of Hayes's cabinet resigned within a single week, citing policy differences, but clearly trying to distance themselves from the growing scandal. Guardian Corporation's stock price plummeted as investors fled, and their board of directors called an emergency meeting to discuss Hayes's liability to their interests. The political protection they had purchased was becoming a financial disaster. Marcus received word of these developments through Patterson's daily updates, but his situation remained dangerous. The guard post had become increasingly isolated, with backup personnel failing to arrive and communication systems continuing to malfunction. It was clear that someone was positioning him for elimination while maintaining plausible deniability. The crisis reached its peak when Sinclair failed to appear for her scheduled testimony. Her office reported she was suffering from flu symptoms, but Patterson suspected more serious interference. A welfare check at Sinclair's residence found her unconscious from what appeared to be a drug overdose. Sinclair survived, but remained hospitalized under heavy sedation. The timing was suspicious enough that Patterson petitioned the court for protective custody for all remaining witnesses, including Marcus. Judge Elizabeth Warren, who was presiding over the case, was a veteran of high-profile political trials. She had seen government intimidation tactics before and was not impressed by the pattern of convenient illnesses and accidents affecting witnesses. Mr. Morrison, Judge Warren addressed the government's lead counsel. I'm deeply concerned about the safety of witnesses in this case. I'm granting protective custody for Mr. Thompson immediately, and I want explanations for Ms. Sinclair's condition. The protective custody order changed everything. Marcus was moved from his isolated post to a secure federal facility where his safety could be guaranteed. For the first time in months, he slept through the night without threatening phone calls. As the second phase of his legal battle concluded, Marcus realized that his decision to speak out had unleashed forces far beyond his original understanding. What began as a simple matter of reporting criminal activity had evolved into a constitutional crisis that threatened to bring down the government. Standing in his secure facility, looking out at armed guards protecting him from his own government, Marcus thought about the journey that had brought him to this point. The naive royal guard who simply wanted to serve his country with honor had been replaced by a man who understood the true cost of speaking truth to power. The recordings provided by Sinclair were being authenticated by FBI technical experts. Soon, the world would hear Hayes's own voice planning murders and laughing about dead journalists. The case was no longer just about money or justice. It was about whether the rule of law could survive when those in power believed themselves above all consequences. Marcus Thompson had served the Royal Guard for 15 years when his life changed forever on a cold Tuesday morning in October. Standing at attention outside the Prime Minister's residence, he never expected that a single conversation would lead to the largest lawsuit in political history. The morning started like any other. Marcus arrived at his post at 5:30, inspecting his uniform one final time before beginning his shift. His black boots gleamed under the streetlights, and his ceremonial sword hung perfectly at his side. After years of service protecting high-ranking officials, Marcus took pride in his appearance and dedication to duty. Prime Minister Jonathan Hayes was scheduled for a private meeting with Deputy Prime Minister Victoria Sinclair that morning. Marcus had been assigned to escort Hayes from his private quarters to the secure meeting room on the third floor. It was supposed to be a routine security detail, nothing more than walking alongside the country's leader and ensuring his safety. As they walked through the marble corridors, Hayes seemed unusually tense. His usual morning greetings were absent, and he kept checking his phone every few seconds. Marcus noticed, but maintained his professional silence. Royal Guards were trained to observe everything while appearing to see nothing. The meeting room was already prepared when they arrived. Marcus positioned himself outside the heavy oak doors, as protocol required. He could hear muffled voices from inside, but paid no attention to the content. His job was security, not intelligence gathering. 20 minutes into the meeting, Marcus heard raised voices. This was unusual. Hayes typically conducted business in calm, measured tones. The volume continued to increase until Marcus could clearly distinguish individual words through the thick doors. The investigation needs to disappear, Hayes was saying. Whatever it takes, make it go away. I don't care about the methods. Marcus felt his stomach drop. As a royal guard, he was bound by oath to protect not just the physical safety of officials, but also to uphold the integrity of the office. What he was hearing sounded like something far worse than political maneuvering. Sinclair's voice was equally clear now. The environmental report contains evidence that could destroy your administration. The cover-up has already cost 3 lives, Jonathan. How much further are you willing to go? As far as necessary, Hayes replied without hesitation. The Guardian Corporation has too much at stake. They've invested millions in this project, and they expect results. If a few more people need to have accidents, so be it. Marcus pressed himself closer to the door. His training told him to step away, to pretend he heard nothing. But his conscience wouldn't allow it. 3 people were already dead, and the Prime Minister was discussing more murders as casually as planning dinner. "The Royal Guard Marcus Thompson is right outside," Sinclair warned. "We should discuss this elsewhere." "Thompson?" Hayes laughed coldly. "He's been my escort for months. Completely loyal, completely silent. These military types never ask questions. They just follow orders." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes. Marcus learned that the Guardian Corporation had been dumping toxic waste in rural communities for over 2 years. The environmental impact was devastating, but the financial benefits to Hayes's political party were enormous. When investigative journalist Sarah Mitchell had gotten too close to the truth, she died in what was reported as a car accident. 2 environmental scientists who discovered the contamination levels had similarly suspicious deaths. Marcus stood frozen outside that door, realizing he was witnessing the confession to multiple murders committed for corporate profit. The man he was sworn to protect was a killer who viewed human lives as obstacles to financial gain. When the meeting ended, Hayes emerged looking relaxed and confident. He smiled at Marcus as if nothing had happened. "Ready for the next appointment, Thompson?" Marcus nodded professionally, but inside he was falling apart. Everything he believed about duty and honor was crashing down around him. The oath he took to protect Hayes suddenly felt like a betrayal of everything he truly stood for. That evening, Marcus sat in his small apartment staring at the wall. His wife Elena had died 3 years earlier from cancer, leaving him alone with his thoughts and his commitment to service. She had always admired his integrity, his unwillingness to compromise his values for convenience or advancement. He thought about Sarah Mitchell's family. The journalist had 2 young children who would grow up without their mother because she tried to tell the truth. The environmental scientists had dedicated their lives to protecting public health, only to be murdered for their discoveries. Marcus realized he faced an impossible choice. He could remain silent, continue his service, and allow more innocent people to die. Or he could speak out, destroy his career, and face the full power of the government's legal machinery. By morning, his decision was made. Marcus contacted the law firm of Patterson, Williams & Associates, known for taking on powerful opponents. He requested an immediate meeting with senior partner Catherine Patterson, explaining only that he had information about serious crimes committed by high-ranking officials. Patterson agreed to see him that afternoon. Marcus arrived wearing civilian clothes, feeling naked without his uniform. The law office was elegant but understated, with dark wood paneling and walls lined with legal volumes. Catherine Patterson was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to see everything. She had built her reputation on winning impossible cases against corporations and government agencies that thought themselves untouchable. "Mr. Thompson," she began, "I understand you have information about criminal activity. Before we proceed, I need you to understand that anything you tell me is protected by attorney-client privilege, but it also means you're committed to seeing this through to the end." Marcus took a deep breath. Prime Minister Hayes is responsible for at least 3 murders. He's covering up environmental crimes that are killing innocent people, and he's planning to kill more witnesses. Patterson leaned forward, her expression intensifying. "Those are serious accusations. Do you have evidence?" "I overheard a detailed confession. I can provide dates, times, specific statements. I know about the Guardian Corporation's involvement and the financial arrangements." For the next 2 hours, Marcus recounted everything he had heard. Patterson took detailed notes, asking clarifying questions about timelines and specific phrases. When he finished, she sat back in her chair. "Mr. Thompson, what you're describing is a conspiracy involving murder, environmental crimes, and corruption at the highest levels of government. Taking this on means challenging some of the most powerful people in the country." Marcus nodded. "I understand the risks. But I can't stay silent while more people die." Patterson studied him carefully. "There's something else you need to consider. Given the nature of these crimes and the cover-up involved, your life is probably in danger. If Hayes is willing to kill journalists and scientists, he won't hesitate to eliminate a royal guard who can expose him." The weight of her words settled over Marcus like a cold blanket. He hadn't fully considered that speaking out might cost him his life. But then he thought about Elena, about the values she had admired in him, about Sarah Mitchell's children growing up without their mother. "What do you recommend?" he asked. "We file a comprehensive lawsuit immediately. We make this public before they have time to silence you. The lawsuit will include wrongful death claims for the 3 victims, environmental damage claims, and a civil rights violation claim for the conspiracy to suppress the truth." Patterson pulled out a legal pad and began sketching the framework. "We'll demand $300 million in damages. The amount serves 2 purposes. It gets media attention, and it reflects the true cost of their crimes to society." Marcus felt a mixture of fear and determination. How long will this take? Cases like this can take years. Hayes and the Guardian Corporation will use every legal tactic to delay and discredit us. They'll attack your credibility, your motives, your mental state. They'll make your life miserable. But we can win. Patterson smiled grimly. "With your testimony and the investigation it will trigger, yes, we can win. But it won't be easy, and it won't be quick." Marcus signed the legal documents that afternoon, officially beginning a war against one of the most powerful men in the country. As he left the law office, he felt the weight of his decision settling on his shoulders. That evening, he sat in his apartment and wrote a letter to Elena, something he did whenever he faced major decisions. He told her about his choice, about the risks he was taking, about his hope that she would be proud of him for choosing truth over safety. The next morning brought the first sign of retaliation. Marcus arrived at his usual post to find Captain Reynolds waiting for him with reassignment orders. He was being transferred to night duty at a remote government facility outside the city, effective immediately. "I don't understand, Captain," Marcus said. "Has my performance been unsatisfactory?" Reynolds avoided eye contact. "New security protocols, Thompson. Nothing personal." Marcus realized the isolation had already begun. Hayes was removing him from positions where he might overhear additional information or have access to other potential witnesses. The battle was starting, and Marcus was already feeling the first casualties. As he drove to his new assignment that evening, Marcus reflected on the choice he had made. There would be no going back now. He had crossed a line that would define the rest of his life, however long that might be. The remote facility was a stark concrete building surrounded by high fences and security cameras. His new post was a guard station where he would sit alone for 8 hours, watching empty hallways and monitoring security feeds. It was clearly designed to isolate him and limit his access to information. But Marcus felt a sense of peace as he settled into his new routine. He had chosen truth over comfort, justice over security. Whatever happened next, he would face it knowing he had done the right thing. The lawsuit was filed 3 days later. Patterson had worked around the clock to prepare the documents, knowing that speed was essential for Marcus's safety. The filing was immediately sealed by court order to protect the investigation, but word began to leak within hours. Marcus received a phone call at 2 in the morning from an unknown number. When he answered, a distorted voice delivered a simple message: "Drop the lawsuit, or join your journalist friend." He hung up without responding, but the threat was clear. Sarah Mitchell had died for pursuing the truth. Now Marcus was in the same position, with the same people determined to silence him. The next few weeks would test everything Marcus believed about courage, justice, and the power of truth to overcome corruption. He had fired the first shot in a war that would consume his life and challenge the very foundations of the government he had served faithfully for 15 years. Standing at his lonely post in the remote facility, watching empty corridors and counting the hours until dawn, Marcus Thompson prepared for the fight of his life. He had chosen to stand against evil, regardless of the cost. Now he had to survive long enough to see justice served.